The Will to DIY is a podcast where Ryder explores the deconstructionalism of masculinity.
Hello, I'm Ryder Richards. Welcome back. Many thanks to those of you supporting the show. This week, I'm pulling ideas almost exclusively from Shopclass as Soulcraft by Matthew Crawford. Of course, I'll be elaborating points I find compelling, and there's a couple shout outs to earlier podcasts in The Will to DIY. I hope you enjoy it. Part 1.
I think, therefore I am, Rene Descartes.
Obviously, this phrase comes from a man sitting alone, thinking about perception. He's thinking about thinking. This is also known as metacognition. And Descartes was looking for how he can know if he existed. So this is kind of existentialism. Because, what if you're stuck in a dream and this is all a dream, or we're in the Matrix and it's all run by the devil? Well, he kind of centered on this active thinking as a way to know he existed. And this is sort of spurred on this Western modern conundrum of the individual, where your internal monologue is who you are. Your rationality in your head, the little voices, that is you. But of course, this isn't the only way to know yourself. Let's not forget that non-Western teachings and religions work to dismantle this illusion. And even some Western philosophers, like Schopenhauer, he questioned the use of this kind of self-contained thinking model. Considering it now, like in hindsight, of course, obviously Descartes was sitting alone, examining his own mind. This would naturally lead him to champion his own mind processes. Versus if he was hanging out in a group, then all of a sudden he'd be championing community processes. Or being a natural scientist, he would be championing objective reality. But of course, if he was sitting on the toilet, it might have been bowel processes. Who knows? The problem is this I think, therefore I am has the word I in it twice. And just seeing that, you kind of go, well, this is kind of a solipsistic assertion from isolation, right? This is a completely narcissistic kind of thing. It's a me predicate. It's an identity response from a disengaged rationalist. In Shopclass for Soulcraft, Crawford sort of casually asserts that Descartes drives a wedge between ethics and reason by focusing on the reason and intellect, where the internal knowledge of yourself is primary over all other ways you might possibly find meaning in your existence. So if my identity is formed through internal metacognition to the exclusion of any kind of external societal engagement, then how do I develop virtues such as morality, empathy, and ethical consideration of others? Crawford suggests they cannot be separate, but moral and intellectual virtues are entangled, one driving or infusing the other. And if we go back to Aristotle, then you see that actions are caused by a choice. But the cause of an action is a desire that leads us towards an end. So the desire shapes our end goal, so we reason towards it, and that's what drives our actions. That's if we're actually thinking about anything at all. This is kind of an ends-means process, also known as instrumental reason. And there's guys like Adorno and Habermas who discuss the problems with it. What we need to consider is if our desire shapes our rational path towards action, towards some sort of end, then, do we have a morality that acts as guide rails or bumpers to really ensure our ends actually result in an ethical outcome?
I grew up all alone. It was a hard life in front of an iPad. I play, therefore I am. Out here in the West, it's winner takes all. When I want something, I take it. Only Sheriff Ryder gets in my way. That do-gooder always protecting his video game store. Oh, and being nice to small persons and animal kind. And taking baths. Ooh.
Part 2. Almost every bad guy in a story puts his or her desires first, ahead of the common good, ahead of others. They tend to either be these kind of supreme intellects, these sociopathic narcissists, or they're some sort of desire-driven animal. Well, many authors will warn of our desires that become focused in unethical directions. And while it's easy to see in an individual, hey, look, that's the bad guy, it's much harder to see in a society because it's in the air that we breathe. So for instance, in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, this depicts a technocracy which sort of champions scientific achievement, and it tends to mistake advancement and rationality for human progress. What this does is it confounds ends and means and desires, where for the sake of humanity, we come to desire progress, which only tends to demean and alienate humans more. So we work harder and harder to fulfill more and more desires, but the ends are not directed towards human fulfillment, so we're always left hollow. Well, this really isn't fiction anymore. This is a pervasive ethos and ideology and episteme where conversations about values such as morality and ethics and virtue, they're sort of ignored and they quickly dissipate. I mean, it's really kind of like a fart in the middle of a meeting, and everyone's just slightly embarrassed for the uncivilized sap who doesn't know that we have moved beyond such gross humanity. I mean, selfishness is now a virtue, institutional interests are primary to the human disposition, and we no longer really have ethics, or bowels maybe, I don't know, where maybe all just heads in tanks. It's like we're back in the Matrix. Our desires are now programmed. They're the corporate desires, the crowd desires, and our conformity is the only thing that ensures our survival. It sort of reminds me of this quote by Upton Sinclair. It's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on him not understanding it. On idiots. From the Greek, idios means private, and idiotes is a private person. Now this is really kind of opposed as to a public person, and this is talking about their public role. So why is somebody an idiot? It's basically because they don't or refuse to understand their public role, which should entail a relationship of active concern to others and to their problems. To be private while in your public role is really disengagement, it's unknowing, and it's self-interest. It's not being aware that your role in society is to be good at what you do, your public job. It's to help others who have problems. So why is a private person or idiot a pejorative term? It isn't that the person is dumb necessarily, it's really about context. They are in public, their public role, but they're not helping the public. They remain selfishly attached to their ideas, desires, and comfort rather than realizing that the service that you offer to the public is a societal good. And when you mess up just because you're unconcerned or unaware, it hurts other people, and that hurts society. So basically, thank you, Descartes, for undermining the Greek notion of the self as a public-private relations dynamic and turning it into a private-private wankfest of self-involved douchery. Part 3. How did we get here? Crawford mentions that each one of us has a disposition, and that leads us into certain jobs where our, quote, manner of feeling relates to and forms our manner of thinking. But also our daily activities, our jobs, those equally work to form us. And naturally, of course, we see our prestige reflected through society, and our current society really champions knowledge work. So for our disposition, it may direct us, but the social prestige also sort of has its thumbs on the scales for which kind of positions we want to take. Crawford ends up discussing this lure of easy intellectual mastery, wherein the world is turned into a cognitive model. And this is really just kind of the realm of the ideal. This is a perfect place where reality seldom intrudes. Here I can develop the idea of a perfect motor or a vacuum, or heck, you can even come up with string theory. And in this realm of math, it all works. But it doesn't work when you bring it back to reality. And thus our sort of rational, calculated means to relate to the world that we've been championing, it really fails us, and we're left sort of confused and affronted here. Our idea, our model of the world does not account for the messy and highly fickle particulars of reality. So a lot of people are left with a choice when this happens. You can go back into theory, or you can stay in practice. This is episteme or techne. So you can go back to academia, back to models and math, or you can struggle in reality with this unordered mess. In both areas, you can pursue truth. But Crawford offers a small distinction here. Theory really does this thing where it asserts how the world should work, while practice requires an attentiveness to how it actually works. Aristotle mentions that art or craft, techne, by its nature includes a struggle, where human efforts are not fully effective. They tend to waver between ideas of fatalism, which is being subservient to what the world demands, and mastery. I will shape the world to my desires. And of course, in the practice of craft, between these two poles, we find some idea of what real human agency is about. So art or craft kind of fluctuate between this assertiveness and attentiveness, But there's a distinction in the arts, right? For the carpenter or the artist, the carpenter who's maybe building a house, the artist making a drawing, they start out with a blank slate, and through their process, they construct something new. And you kind of have the ability to go backwards in time and account for each one of the actions as it led toward the finished product, even if it falls short of the intended vision. But what happens when your art is being a doctor or a mechanic? In this case, you're not starting from scratch, right? Your patient or the car shows up with an unknown history, and of course you weren't the creator, so you'll never know in an absolute or comprehensive way the entirety of the thing you're trying to fix. There's always something you might miss, and you're kind of in the realm of the unknown, so you must become kind of a forensic detective in this instance. Aristotle calls this kind of art the stochastic art, where the goal of the art is not to produce something, but to promote a thing as much as possible. So the mechanic and the doctor must approach with this kind of openness and humility to correctly diagnose an issue, to repair it, and promote wellness. This requires attentiveness, and Crawford says that fixing things may end up being the cure for narcissism. Well, why is that? Openness, attentiveness, these are incompatible with self-absorption. I think, therefore I am. Yeah, that has very little to do with diagnosing a patient or an engine. You have to care in a very personal way to find root causes for these kind of things that are happening to an external object. And those root causes can only be found in subtle patterns. Because they're subtle, if you're not actively seeking out data, you're going to miss it. So you have to be engaged. As well, you have to have the knowledge to know what you're looking for. You cannot be passive and be good at your job. You must be concerned enough to care and also curious and open to admitting that you don't know something. Ego and pride really has no place here. Well, this becomes an ethical concern. It's really about how you approach the world. It's how you think. If you're a spectator, if you're not actively seeking or caring, if you're not involved, then all of your diagnoses will be rote, right? We slip out of engaging reality and we slip into our heads, and then we begin asserting solutions and pushing them onto the world, and then we just have to hope that things work. As an artist, for me, this is when I start drawing clouds as bubbles or trees as triangles. This is an icon of the thing itself. It's not the real thing. It's not reality that I'm drawing. So if you're a doctor and you see a fever and your instant inclination is to say COVID, if you're a mechanic and you just know it's tippets, well, no, that didn't work. Okay, I just know that it's pistons. No, that didn't work either. And after the machine has been returned to you 3 or 4 times for all your misdiagnoses, well, then you have to kind of throw up your hands and declare yourself an idiot, which in this case, you technically are because you're being assertive and not attentive. And finally, you call somebody in who has the right disposition, a knowledgeable person who is attentive, somebody who cares and engages with the reality you can't be bothered to pay attention to. The idiot model. With Taylorism workplace practices, this is where knowledge workers and knowledge engineers break apart complex tasks into simple steps so a corporation can hire unskilled labor and still accomplish the same end result. Well, there's been a dumbing down of the labor pool. It's almost as if corporations say, we only now want idiots. And thus, the only workers that can be found tend to be these kind of script-reading automatons with no ability to process ambiguous problems that show up every day. The consequence is a moral re-education, away from disciplined attentiveness and ethical entanglements. It's really a disincentive to workers for caring. Thoughtfulness can be disruptive, and for automatons, that might actually get you fired. Now, we should push back, and Crawford's suggestion is to, quote, sustain pockets of mindful labor. This is similar to buying local produce, but on a slightly larger scale. Take your car to a mechanic to rebuild the engine instead of buying a new engine from a factory in Mexico. Don't champion absentee capital and systemized carelessness. Instead, promote attentive personal knowledge and public spiritedness. Support people who are a counterweight against the culture of narcissism. Let me leave you with one additional thought. The Stoics saw techne, the craft of life, as a virtue to be practiced. So go out and do some practicing. Until next time.